Pastor Ed here with our weekly devotion for Thursday, August 27th. Uh, again, based on our reading from this past Sunday, which was from the book of Esther, chapter 4, verses 1 through 17. I'm not going to read it for you again. If you'd like to reacquaint yourself with it, or if you weren't in church on Sunday, you might want to look at it. But some other thoughts on that particular reading. And then, of course, we're going to have another reading from Esther this coming Sunday as well. I'd like to start with a story. A fellow by the name of Zach Arnwine and his fiancée were once driving just east of Germantown, Ohio, which is near Dayton, on Black Friday, when they saw a FedEx truck with its flashers on pulled over by the side of the road. And as they drove past, it looked like the driver was throwing things out of the truck. He had the door wide open, said the fiancé, Tristan Raish. And so they turned around and went back to investigate. We were doing a little creep on him, Raish later told reporters. But when they got back to where they had seen this taking place, the driver, unfortunately, was already gone. And so we pulled up to where he was, and there were packages lying everywhere, Zach explained, and that broke my heart, said Raish. Well, initially they debated calling the police, but the more they thought about it, the more they feared that it would mean an even longer wait for those packages to reach their destinations. They didn't want them to end up in an evidence room over the holidays for sure. So instead they picked up the packages, decided to deliver them themselves. So they called every number then on every box, told the recipients that they would deliver their packages to their homes. Just seemed like the right thing to do, they said, even though it took them several hours to complete their mission. Well, speaking of the customers who received their packages, they were amazed, Arnwine said, not to mention thankful as well, I'm guessing. Royce Charbonneau was one of those customers. We were on the way home when we got a call, Charbonneau said. It's a number I don't know, and I usually don't answer numbers I don't know, but I did, and it was this guy named Zach, and he said he had our package, and I didn't believe him at first, but then after I met Zach and talked to him in person, I believed it. He then added that while he was thrilled to get one of the two packages he was expecting, the other one, however, is still missing. While happy to make these deliveries at the time, Arnwine said he hoped the driver was caught before he could have dumped even more parcels, because that's just wrong for that time of year. Raish added that they would do the same again, would want somebody else to do it as well. Which leads me to ask, you've probably heard the expression being in the right place at the right time. Well, that was certainly the case for Zach Arnwine and his fiancée, Tristan Raish. Because if they hadn't been driving past that FedEx driver just as he was tossing out those packages, the packages might never have been found for a very long time, if indeed at all. And it's even less likely that they would have ever been delivered to their intended recipients, certainly not in time for Christmas. Now, while Zach and Tristan potentially rescued Christmas, or at least a small part of it, for those whose packages had been abandoned by the side of the road, our Bible reading this week from Esther deals with an actual rescue. In other words, the rescue of a people, a lot of people, in fact, and not just some packages. But just like Zach and Tristan, Esther was also fortunate enough to find herself at the right place at precisely the right time. As I mentioned on Sunday, a noteworthy thing about Esther and the entire book, not just this reading, is that it's the only book in the Bible that does not mention God by name, not even so much as a reference, which of course makes it rather unique, to say the least. And yet the story itself is a compelling one, even a timely one, even for those of us living as we do in the 21st century, some 2,400 years after the events that it describes took place. You've heard me speak before about the Babylonian exile, that period of time when the Jewish people were taken into captivity in Babylon. And subsequently, the Babylonians themselves were then conquered by the Persians, who let many of the Jews return to their homeland, but not all of them chose to do so. And so Esther then is a descendant of those Jews who had chosen to stay in exile in Persia. Well, the king at that time was a fellow named Xerxes, one of the most illustrious leaders of the ancient world. And at one point he held a great feast for all of his noblemen, to which he also invited his royal wife, Queen Vashti. Vashti, however, refused to make an appearance. And as a result, Xerxes dumped her, began to search throughout his kingdom for a new queen. He did this by assembling the most beautiful women in his kingdom to choose from, and lo and behold, he chooses Esther. And Esther at the time was a young Jewish orphan girl being raised by her cousin Mordecai. But here's the thing, Xerxes didn't know that she was Jewish. Well, anyway, we also have this guy named Haman, who was the king's prime minister. And of course, that made him a very powerful man, a man used to receiving homage and deference from the lesser nobles and officials. And Haman then comes into contact with Mordecai, Esther's cousin. And although Haman at this point doesn't know that she is his cousin. Anyway, during the meetings, Mordecai refuses to bow down before Haman, which was a sign of worship and was thus forbidden of Jews. Well, naturally, this made Haman very angry, and in retaliation, he organized a plot to kill every Jew in the kingdom. Now, he couldn't do this all by himself, of course, so he convinced the king that the Jews were planning a rebellion, and for that reason had to be eliminated. Completely unaware of the potential and personal ramifications of such a decision, after all, his new queen is herself a Jew, Xerxes nevertheless goes along and he issues a decree that all the Jews were to be killed on a certain day. Mordecai, however, catches wind of the plan. It's at this point that our reading this past Sunday ended. Well, Mordecai, as we heard our lesson began, actually, Mordecai, as we heard on Sunday, is beside himself, having torn off his clothes and putting on sackcloth and ashes, which were a traditional sign of sorrow and regret. And when Esther sends her servant to find out why, he returns not only with the reason, but also Mordecai's request that she go personally to the king in order to intercede on behalf of her people. Well, Esther, as we heard, at first hesitates. After all, it seems like a rather simple and straightforward request, right? But as Esther explains in a message back to Mordecai, anyone who dares to go to the king without first being called to do so would by law be put to death. And that even included the queen herself as well. No doubt Esther was well aware of what had happened to her predecessor for simply not showing up at a banquet. However, Mordecai replies to Esther by saying, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews." And then as we heard, he added, "For if you keep silence at a time such as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish." We'll stop there for just a moment. While God's name does not appear anywhere in the book of Esther, as previously noted, the reality of God's presence, not to mention God's ability to intervene in human affairs, is never in doubt, however. In other words, Mordecai implies here that the relief and deliverance will arise from somewhere else if it does in fact come from as a result of Esther's intervention, from God working as so often does behind the scenes. On the other hand, if Esther does in fact intervene on behalf of her people, as I noted on Sunday, nothing really changes, does it? It'll still be God working behind the scenes, so to speak. After all, one could argue, who was it that put Esther on the throne as queen in the first place? Well, then to seal the deal, Mordecai offers precisely this possibility. Who knows, he says to his cousin Esther, perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Well, apparently it worked, because Esther responded, I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. And it's at this point that our reading on Sunday ended, but I won't keep you hanging. She indeed risks her life to plead for her people, while at the same time revealing Haman's treachery. And in response, and because a Persian king's decree could not be rescinded, Xerxes made another decree giving the Jews permission to defend themselves and their property against any attack. And so in the end, the Jews defeated their enemies on the day originally set to destroy them. Haman was executed by the king for his lies and his fiendish plot. And Mordecai was then given Haman's position as prime minister over the empire, and Esther herself remained the queen and the beloved wife of Xerxes. The end. Only it's not, of course. We have a few loose ends to tie up yet. For starters, just so you know, the story of Esther is how the Jewish festival of Purim came to be, the annual festival commemorating the saving of the Jewish people from the evil Haman. It's an annual festival marked by the exchange of gifts and food, donating charity to the poor, eating a celebratory meal, and special readings and prayers. Other customs include wearing masks and costumes and public celebrations and parades. And men in particular are encouraged to drink wine or any other alcoholic beverage. Sounds pretty good to me. And then we have the question of exactly why this story in particular was chosen to be included in Scripture. Again, after all, God's name never is even mentioned, not once. But here's the thing. The story of Esther is a reminder once again that God so often works through one person, a single life, as I noted on Sunday. One life, one single life. But there's another thing, something that I became acutely aware of, and maybe you've made the connection as well, and it's more than just mere coincidence. In other words, what's the story of Esther? What does the story of Esther have to do with us, with you and me? You might ask. Well, after all, it occurred over 2,000 years ago. Issue at the time was resolved. The disaster averted. What bearing, therefore, could it possibly have on us today? A story of a plot to eradicate an entire people, namely the Jews? Where have we heard that story before? Oh, that's right. We may be 2,400 years removed from the time of Esther, but we're barely 80 years removed from the Holocaust and the extermination of 6 million Jews. What does the story of Esther have to remind us? Oh, yeah, it's only been 9 years since the rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where hate-filled marchers chanted, "The Jews will not replace us." It's only been 8 years since the anti-Semitic terrorist attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, in which 11 people were killed, 6 wounded, including several Holocaust survivors. It's believed to be the deadliest attack ever on the Jewish community in the United States. As a prominent rabbi once pointed out, American Jews represent only 2.4% of the population, but they are the recipients of 63% of religious hate crimes. Let that one sink in for just a moment. And that's not even getting into the whole issue about the treatment and the deportations of aliens, so-called aliens, in recent years, even though some are here legally. I don't believe in coincidences. Maybe God placed the story of Esther in our scriptures and before our eyes once again this week and in our hearts on purpose. Maybe, just maybe, for a time such as this. Well, I hope you're having a good week, as always. As always, I invite you to come and join us for the conclusion of the story. I kind of gave this conclusion away, but we're going to talk a little bit more about that, the rest of the story. And we'll see you then, either live or if you catch us on a recording later that day or next week even. And I'll be back next week with another weekly devotion. Until then, take care. Bye.